A 6-week human trial just measured over 90 inflammatory proteins in real people's blood. And what came out on top wasn't a pharmaceutical. It wasn't even omega-3. It was a 2-ingredient shake you could make in your own kitchen before breakfast. I'm Dr. Steve Collins, and today we're pulling this study apart completely. What it found, why it matters, who it actually helps, and exactly how you can replicate this at home with ingredients you can find almost anywhere. Now, before we go any further, this is not an anti-omega-3 piece. Omega-3 is still one of the most well-supported anti-inflammatory tools we have. But this study reveals something deeper, something about where inflammation is actually being generated in a lot of people's bodies. And once you understand this mechanism, the way you think about chronic inflammation will permanently shift. So let's get into it. The study ran for 6 weeks, real human participants, blood panels before the intervention, blood panels after. And the researchers didn't just track 1 or 2 standard markers like CRP alone. They mapped a network of over 90 inflammatory proteins simultaneously. That matters enormously because chronic inflammation is not a single signal, it's a cascade. It's an ecosystem reacting, not one alarm going off in isolation. 4 groups were compared. One group supplemented with omega-3 at a standard daily dose. A second group took a single prebiotic fiber, specifically inulin, on its own. A third group consumed what researchers called a synbiotic. That's a combination of a live fermented drink and a multi-source fiber blend mixed together as a daily shake. And the fourth group took nothing, a true control. After 6 weeks, all 3 intervention groups showed reduced inflammatory signaling compared to the control. But the differences between them, that's where it gets genuinely fascinating. Omega-3 did what omega-3 is known to do. It brought down a targeted cluster of classic inflammatory markers, including TNF-alpha, solid, predictable, evidence-backed. The single prebiotic fiber group showed a similar pattern, meaningful but limited in range. Now here is where you need to pay close attention. The synbiotic shake group was different, not slightly different, clearly different. It reduced a far broader spectrum of inflammatory proteins, including IL-6, and multiple immune signaling molecules that are specifically tied to gut lining inflammation. This wasn't just a general dampening of the inflammatory fire. It looked like the source of that fire, the gut wall itself, was being directly addressed. And the effect sizes across the markers were consistently larger than omega-3, not borderline, not marginal, larger. But then the researchers looked at one more thing, and this is the part that explains everything. They measured short-chain fatty acids circulating in the bloodstream. These are molecules your gut bacteria produce when they break down fiber through fermentation. And one of the most critical short-chain fatty acids is butyrate. After the synbiotic shake intervention, butyrate levels rose significantly. And here's the signal that matters. The higher butyrate climbed, the more IL-6 fell. That's a direct inverse correlation between a gut-derived molecule and one of the body's primary drivers of chronic low-grade inflammation. IL-6. Let's define this quickly because it matters. It's a cytokine, which is essentially a chemical messenger your immune cells use to coordinate inflammatory responses. When IL-6 stays persistently elevated, it's not fighting an infection anymore. It's become background noise. That background inflammatory state is linked to fatigue you can't explain, brain fog that never fully clears, metabolic disruption, joint discomfort, and in some people, the early architecture of autoimmune conditions. So when butyrate rises and IL-6 falls, that's not a trivial finding. That's the body recalibrating its own inflammatory thermostat. And this is the key distinction between what the shake did and what omega-3 does. Omega-3 works like a fire suppression system. It enters circulation and damps down inflammatory signals from the outside. Effective. But the shake worked differently. It changed the gut environment in a way that caused the body to generate its own anti-inflammatory signals from within. That's a fundamentally different level of intervention. It's not suppressing the fire, it's removing the fuel source. Now, why does this matter more for some people than others? Because the origin of your inflammation determines which strategy will actually work. If your inflammatory load is primarily driven by acute injury, active infection, or a specific immune condition, omega-3 alone may be perfectly adequate. But a significant portion of people living with chronic low-grade inflammation have what we'd call gut origin inflammation. And the tricky thing is that many of them don't even know it. Yes, this group includes people with obvious gut symptoms, the bloating, the food sensitivities, the irregular digestion, reflux, or IBS pattern symptoms. But it also includes people with no obvious gut complaints at all, who still deal with persistent fatigue, joint aches, mood instability, brain fog, or just a sense that something is always slightly off inside. These individuals, and there are far more of them than we think, often have a disrupted gut barrier combined with a microbiome that has lost its diversity. When that happens, the gut wall becomes permeable. Immune cells in the lining go on alert. Cytokines enter circulation. and that inflammatory signal spreads into every system in the body. This is educational, not medical advice. We're evidence-led here, and we manage risk carefully. But understanding where inflammation originates is the first step toward actually resolving it, not just managing symptoms. Omega-3 can reduce the intensity of that cytokine output. What it cannot do is rebuild the gut barrier, diversify the microbiome, or restore the butyrate-producing bacterial communities that regulate immune signaling in the first place. The symbiotic shake, according to this trial's data, appears to do exactly that, and that's why its effects were broader. It wasn't just reducing one output signal, it was working upstream, at the system level. So what was actually in this shake? Let's get practical. There were two primary components. The first was a fermented dairy drink, specifically goat milk kefir, at around 170 milliliters per day. What makes kefir different from a standard probiotic capsule is the number and diversity of live bacterial cultures it carries. This particular kefir contained 27 naturally occurring bacterial strains, not one isolated strain in a lab. A complex, living microbial ecosystem inside a fermented food. That ecological complexity matters. Different bacterial species perform different functions. Some specialize in producing short-chain fatty acids like butyrate. Others reinforce the structural integrity of the gut lining. Others modulate immune cell behavior directly. Diversity in the microbiome creates resilience. It's not just about having more bacteria, it's about having the right variety of them. The second component was a prebiotic fiber blend, 10 grams per day, consisting of 18 different fiber types drawn from multiple plant sources. Things like inulin, resistant starch, pectin, and beta-glucans. Now here's what you need to understand about fiber diversity and why it's not interchangeable. Different bacterial species in your gut specialize in fermenting different types of fiber. If you take a single fiber supplement, you're selectively feeding a narrow community of microbes. But when you bring in multiple fiber types simultaneously, you're feeding a broad ecosystem. You're creating the conditions for a more diverse, more resilient microbial community to take hold. That's the logic behind the blend, and it's the same logic we should apply when replicating this at home. One important note, the fiber blend used in the study was supplied by the company that also funded the research. We're flagging that transparently. The data is worth examining, but the funding source introduces a layer of bias that can't be ignored. The good news is you don't need to source their exact product to approximate what this shake was doing biologically. Here's how you can build a realistic home version. Start with your kefir base, plain, unsweetened kefir. Goat milk if you tolerate it, but standard cow milk kefir will work for most people. If dairy is a problem for you, water kefir or coconut kefir are alternatives, though the study specifically used dairy-based kefir. Aim for 150 to 200 milliliters daily, roughly a small glass. If your gut has never been exposed to fermented foods before, start at 50 to 100 milliliters. Give your microbiome time to adapt. Rushing this is where most people go wrong. For the fiber component, you don't need 18 varieties, but you do need diversity. A practical home blend could include half a teaspoon of inulin powder, half a teaspoon of partially hydrolyzed gar gum or acacia fiber, half a teaspoon of resistant starch such as potato starch, and half a teaspoon of psyllium husk if your gut handles it well. That's 4 structurally distinct fiber types, feeding 4 different bacterial communities. If you want to simplify further, partially hydrolyzed gar gum and resistant starch are among the best tolerated starting points with a broad favorable response in the microbiome literature. Total fiber from these additions sits around 5 to 7 grams, more than enough to begin. You can also blend in a tablespoon of ground flaxseed or a small handful of blueberries or raspberries. Berries bring polyphenols into the picture, and polyphenols interact with gut bacteria in ways that further support the anti-inflammatory signaling cascade. Think of them as the supporting cast that keeps the ecosystem functioning well. Blend everything with your kefir and some water or ice to get the consistency right. That's it. That's the biological foundation of what this trial was testing. Now, and this is critical, do not front load this. More fiber on day 1 is not better. If you pour a large dose of mixed fiber into a gut that is not conditioned for it, you will experience gas, bloating, and cramping. That's not a sign the protocol is working. That's a sign your microbiome is not yet equipped to process it. Start low. Build slowly. Give your internal ecosystem the time to reorganize and adapt. The participants in this study were monitored and gradually introduced to the intervention. Treat your gut with the same care. Consistency matters more than intensity here. This is a daily practice, not a weekly supplement. The 6-week study duration was enough to produce measurable shifts in microbial activity and inflammatory signaling. But those shifts build gradually. You won't feel a dramatic change in week 1. What you may notice over time is improved digestive regularity, more stable energy levels through the day, and a slow reduction in that background low-grade inflammation that many people have been carrying for years without even recognizing it. That's the signal. Watch for it. Ask yourself this. Have you ever addressed your gut microbiome as a direct strategy for managing your inflammation? Or have you only ever approached it from the top down with supplements? Because here's what this data is actually pointing to. Omega-3 and this symbiotic approach are not competing strategies. They're operating at different levels of the same system. Omega-3 works from the bloodstream down, calming cytokine output and reducing the intensity of the inflammatory signal. The symbiotic shake works from the gut up, restoring the microbial conditions that prevent excess inflammatory signaling from being generated in the first place. Run both in parallel, and you're addressing the system from two directions simultaneously. That is a far more complete strategy than either intervention alone. The bigger insight here isn't that any one ingredient is magic. Kefir isn't magic. Fiber diversity isn't magic. What this study actually reveals is that chronic inflammation is often a systems problem. It's not caused by a single deficiency you can correct with one supplement. It's driven by a disrupted gut ecosystem that has lost the capacity to regulate immune signaling on its own. When you restore that ecosystem, when you diversify the microbial community, increase butyrate-producing bacteria, and strengthen the gut barrier, the body begins generating its own anti-inflammatory output, not because you suppressed it, because you gave the system back its tools. If you find this kind of mechanistic breakdown useful, subscribe. We go this deep on every topic we cover. And now here's the part most people aren't asking yet. If the gut inflammation connection is this powerful over 6 weeks, what does a disrupted microbiome look like over 6 years? And what conditions does that quietly set the stage for?